It's been 1 year.
How is this still happening?
Since we first heard his name.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd! Move it down!
Revelations.
We're human, all we want is change.
Solidarity. 1 year to never be forgotten.
The cries of the unheard were heard.
CBS 2 News special report. George Floyd, a racial reckoning, starts now.
And good evening, I'm Christine Johnson.
I'm Maurice Dubois. In the year since George Floyd's death, former officer Derek Chauvin has been convicted of murder, and 3 other officers are awaiting trial.
And we've also seen a worldwide movement to address barriers toward equality and bring them down. Here is CBS 2's Andrea Klein-Thomas.
Find the defendant guilty. Guilty. Guilty.
It's the verdict that captivated a nation gripped by the agony of George Floyd's final pleas.
Tonight will be a joyous night, but tomorrow we still have to dismantle systemic oppression.
Now former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is in jail, awaiting sentencing for murder.
My arms just went up and tears started coming down. Because I thought about how I sat with Mrs. Diallo in that courtroom in Albany, and they came back with her son having been shot at 41 times by police, and they came back every charge not guilty. I thought about Eric Garner never got to court. I thought about Michael Brown never got to court. And it all came down on me that finally there was a family that heard guilty.
This time was different. Fellow officers testified against Chauvin, and a global pandemic made it impossible for anyone to look away.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
Widespread protests blanketed cities large and small, an outrage shared by the most diverse patchwork of humanity. Then tensions ignited, fires were set, businesses looted and vandalized. As curfews and arrests led to violent clashes between protesters and the NYPD. But at the heart of the mostly peaceful protests, renewed demands for police accountability. Still, a flurry of reforms, once left dormant, were fast-tracked through state legislatures. Similar measures are stalled in Congress, while simultaneously, cities like New York continue to confront a sharp spike in violent crime.
Job one is always to keep people safe. And we can do that while creating reform and creating a better NYPD and a fairer NYPD.
1 year later, a racial reckoning is laid bare from the boardroom to the playing field, underscoring this country's painful past often remains present for Black and brown communities. While most protesters have returned home, for longtime activists, the fight gained more steam.
And we needed that victory. Every movement needs victories.
And Reverend Al Sharpton has hardly slowed down.
The name of the special is George Floyd, a racial reckoning with a question mark.
Are we at a moment, or have we seen a movement that has moved the nation? And I don't think the question has been answered, but I think it has now, for the first time, been raised.
Reverend Sharpton says a key component of that answer is the outcome of the case against the 3 other officers charged in George Floyd's death. Their trial has been postponed until next year. Andrea Klein-Thomas, CBS 2 News.
And the impact of George Floyd's death has hit us all in some way, but not nearly as hard as those who knew him best.
Andrea spoke with Floyd's brother Terrence about what it's like to become part of a movement ignited by his brother's death.
I watched that video numerous times. I think I want to say maybe like 40, 50 times. So the only way to hear his voice again was to watch the video.
George Floyd's younger brother Terrence lives in Brooklyn. They share the same father and grew up knowing about each other. But it wasn't until this moment in September of 2016
First time me
that they met face to face. Terrence says their bond was instant and they had so many plans for the future.
It took me 30 plus years to meet him, and in a matter of 5, 6 years they took him from me. It's been a real emotional roller coaster, but having my friends and family, my immediate circle, prayer definitely played a part. And helping me keep sane.
Because beyond the hashtags and protests was a family in mourning.
My brother's gone, but the Floyd name still lives on.
Thrust into the spotlight as a new face of grief in a long-standing movement.
What is that like when you see the protests with the cross-section of the community all saying your brother's name?
I miss him. I would do anything for him to be back here, you know, but I'm proud that his name is going to be in history as changing police reform, changing everything.
What do you want us to know about him?
He wasn't no different than a member of your family. He had his childhood tribulations, but he was trying to make his life better. That was the reason why he went to Minnesota.
You don't have to continue. Why do you say you want to continue in this movement?
He told me I'm a survivor. Even before his demise, that was his message to me. Stay strong, don't quit. We not quitters, we Floyds.
Breonna Taylor, Daniel Prude, Rayshard Brooks, Dante Wright, Andrew Brown Jr., just some of the names families are mourning after confrontations with police officers, adding fuel to the racial justice movement.
So far this year, the organization Mapping Police Violence reports more than 400 people have been killed across the U.S. in police-involved incidents. And despite being 13% of the U.S. population, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed in these situations than whites. And within hours of George Floyd's death, people around the world took to the streets to demand more police accountability.
And those rallying cries are being turned into a series of reforms for the NYPD. CBS 2's Ali Bauman has more.
Thousands of people filled the streets of New York City last year, marching day after day under the summer sun and through the nights, crying out for systemic change.
I thank the people who came out, because without those numbers, you really can't move stuff around.
Hawk Newsom is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Greater New York.
Governor Cuomo called and said, what can we do to calm the city down? We didn't say, let's come together and hug. We said, here's 24 pieces of legislation, okay? What can you do about it?
And of those 24 pieces, how many have been?
4.
Reforms in New York State include banning chokeholds by law enforcement officers, assigning a special prosecutor to police-involved deaths, limiting qualified immunity to make it easier to sue officers for misconduct, and repealing 50A, a law which had shielded police records from the public. Chief of Patrol Juanita Holmes oversees the majority of the NYPD's uniformed officers.
Can we get better? Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. Diversity in the police department, respect, and transparency with discipline.
In the wake of protests, the NYPD agreed on a disciplinary matrix with the Civilian Complaint Review Board, or CCRB, which oversees and investigates NYPD misconduct. Reverend Frederick Davey chairs the board.
So that the discipline that the CCRB recommends is discipline that the commissioner and the department will adhere to.
Why was that necessary?
There can be certainty and a level of assurance both for the officers and the public about what penalties would be associated with what behavior.
But he says stronger civilian oversight is needed.
The CCRB should have final authority over the cases that it independently investigates.
What legislation still needs to be changed?
The Blue Wall bill.
The proposed legislation would make it a felony for officers to falsify police reports.
How do you maintain the momentum of the past year to continue affecting change?
George Floyd's death changed a lot. It became apparent what America listens to. Because we have been out here fighting, because we have been making this impact, they're listening now. Now's the time to be strategic to get what we want.
Ali Bauman, CBS 2 News.
It is not just New York. New Jersey and Connecticut are also tackling police reform.
CBS 2's Kieran Dillon has more on how those states are answering the calls for action.
Do you think that policing can be reformed?
Through better accountability measures, through better transparency, you can have better outcomes. That it is possible to reimagine policing without dismantling the entire system altogether.
As protesters around the country demanded police reform in the wake of George Floyd's death, leaders in the tri-state area went to work. In New Jersey, the overhaul of a decades-old use of force policy was already underway, but Floyd's death created an urgency for more action.
This divide that exists between law enforcement and the communities we serve is only going to widen unless we take steps to bridge it.
Use of force here by an officer towards a civilian is now prohibited unless used as a last resort. The revised policy also mandates all instances of force will be available for the public to review on an online portal. Officers will also have to undergo a mandatory retraining course that focuses on de-escalation.
The core principle of our new policy is respecting the sanctity of life and the dignity of every person with whom a police officer interacts.
Connecticut has a similar mandate for police accountability passed shortly after Floyd's death. Leaders here say reform is not anti-police, but pro-public safety.
We actually can benefit policing and police officers when there's more transparency, accountability, and community buy-in.
This is about dealing with the power distribution that exists and making sure that it's properly checked.
State Senator Gary Winfield and House Representative Steve Staffstrom co-authored the new law. It builds on previous reform bills passed in 2015 and 2019 and creates a statewide watchdog for police misconduct. It also mandates body and dashboard cameras, limits qualified immunity, and limits how much of an officer's disciplinary records can be withheld from the public. Well, the changes have been met with some backlash. Officials in both states say they met with community and police groups when drafting the new policies. They say while more work is necessary, the changes are a step in the right direction. They add any states that have yet to act on police reform should follow their lead. Kieran Dillon, CBS 2 News.
Activists want police department budgets reduced and then the money reinvested in community programs.
While union officials agree changes need to be made, they say the current rhetoric is taking a toll on the NYPD. CBS 2's Andrea Grimes reports.
How is morale?
It's at an all-time low. It's the most difficult time and the most complex time to be a New York City police officer.
Police Benevolent Association President Pat Lynch worries about his members, some 24,000 NYPD officers. He believes many elected officials do not support them at a time when thousands are taking to the streets to protest police.
We get criticized for other states, other towns, and policies that we don't make. Reform has to be broadly looked at. How do you make a better police department, and how do you make a more effective police department? That conversation is not happening.
Lynch points to several factors, including calls to defund the police, a rallying cry thrust into the mainstream after George Floyd's death.
Defund the police means to disband the police. Make no mistake about it.
I actually believe we're moving in the right direction towards abolishment, and that starts with defunding the police.
Trevonna Newsom is co-founder of Black Lives Matter Greater New York. She believes the country needs to completely reimagine policing, and it begins with taking money away from police budgets, including the NYPD's.
The real reason for reallocation of those funds and why we see that police are truly not needed is because areas with the highest rates of unemployment, they also have the highest murder rates. So if we took that money and invested into the community, there would be less of a need for police.
Newsom pointed to initiatives like Cure Violence, where trained civilians mediate neighborhood issues before they result in crime.
When you really target and pour the resources to the persons and people who need it most, you take away half their problems.
Andre Mitchell founded Man Up Inc. in East New York, Brooklyn 12 years ago, an area recently that has among the most shootings in the city. But critics are concerned about what reallocating police funds means for public safety at a time when shootings and subway assaults are up. Last summer, Mayor de Blasio and the city council cut $1 billion from the NYPD's nearly $6 billion budget, in part cutting a police class, reducing overtime, shifting school safety and homeless outreach out of the NYPD. The city says instead, some of that money went to summer youth programs, education, and family and social services. This year, the mayor proposed a slight increase for the NYPD.
If you don't have a well-funded, well-trained police department, and a community that's on board, a community that's teaching their children to respect the police as opposed to hate the police, right? It's never going to work.
You need to have continuing education in the New York City Police Department, and you need to have training that helps us do both ends of the job.
This year, the mayor's budget proposal includes funding for a new police precinct in Queens, which will also house a new community center, plus more money for police overtime the commissioner says will help fight crime. In Midtown, Andrea Grimes, CBS 2 News.
New York State Attorney General Letitia James recently unveiled a proposal to overhaul police policies across the state.
And many on the front lines say legislative action is the future of the fight for police accountability. CBS 2's Corey James has more.
It would give prosecutors a critical additional tool to hold officers accountable for wrongdoing.
This is the latest move of law enforcement reform in New York. Attorney General Tish James announcing the Police Accountability Act, changing the state's law for the use of force by establishing a last resort standard, banning lethal force based on belief a suspect committed a crime, and establishing criminal penalties for police who unlawfully cause physical injury or death.
Because it's not normal for me to be like pepper sprayed or tear gas.
The changes are exactly what Isaac Ortega and thousands of others fought to see following the murder of George Floyd.
We want justice!
Ortega, a New York City activist, helped organize over 40 Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the Empire State, a number of them right here at Washington Square Park.
Feels surreal. This is the site of like a lot of actions for us.
Ortega says in recent months, the movement has largely shifted from protest to policy. Reverend Al Sharpton echoing that and adding putting pressure on the Biden-Harris administration, Senate, and Congress to pass laws are crucial in the continued fight.
So you have to have firmer, clearer laws. The battle now is not only demonstration, but legislation.
That legislation is the George Floyd Policing Act, which is stuck in the Senate. The initiative is designed to stop racial profiling by law enforcement at federal, state, and local levels, banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants, and also requiring deadly force be only used as a last resort after officers have employed de-escalation techniques first. States that do not comply would lose federal policing funding.
There needs to be an investigation of the training.
Dr. Dolores Jones-Brown's a former prosecutor and current criminology professor, believes in addition to passing the reform bill, the next frontier in the fight should also include looking at law enforcement training academies and holding its owners accountable for teaching unnecessary excessive force techniques.
We wouldn't treat animals the way that George Floyd was treated. And the fact that the defense counsel attempted, and it's a common pattern, but attempted to justify Chauvin's behavior because it was something that he was trained to do, means that the Department of Justice and we as a public need to inquire.
While a number of the BLM murals painted on New York City streets are fading, social media pages like this one capture the momentum in an effort to keep it going.
While the numbers have lessened, you're not seeing necessarily 20,000 people for every march. It's really the diehards, the people who have been doing it since May of last year that are still going out every day.
He and other activists are proud of the transformative movement that has ignited some change, but they feel more work needs to be done. Corey James, CBS 2 News.
And the NYPD says it will review the Attorney General's proposal, but calls its use of force guidelines a model of national standards.
Corporate America has long faced criticism for issues with diversity.
Large corporations are now starting to listen, but advocates say more work needs to be done. CBS 2's Jessica Moore reports.
As protesters marched in the streets, companies faced scrutiny for their own records on racial equity. Historically, many companies blamed a lack of diverse candidates for the dismal number of minority hires. Jamal Simmons found that within most major U.S. corporations, including the military, academia, and Fortune 500 companies, only 4% of senior leadership is black.
People get overlooked, they get under-rewarded, and they get over-punished. And so if there's a way for us to deal with those three problems, one way to do that is to get more people, more African Americans in leadership who will begin to look out.
Compassionate leadership expert Magali Renee says while the number of black leaders matters, the climate inside the office is just as important.
That looks inclusive, that looks diverse, that looks equitable, and also looks compassionate. So it really does require that leaders are thinking about more than just the deliverables.
Just as important as the message within the company is the message coming from the company. Several big-name brands recently launched initiatives showing their commitment to change. Amazon imposed a one-year moratorium on facial recognition technology that often misidentifies people of color. Apple created an entrepreneurship camp for young black software developers. Facebook pledged to double the number of Black and Latino employees by 2023 and increase the number of Black leaders by 30%. Walmart is investing $100 million to create a center on racial equity.
It's brand suicide for marketers not to have commercials that look like the country.
Over the past year, mainstream companies like Target and Toyota have increasingly featured Black families in their national ad campaigns.
People need to see themselves, children need to see themselves in ads.
Ultimately, we've got to think about the big picture. What is the kind of world that we want to be a contribution to? What are we really creating? And honestly, organizations, brands, companies, they're an example for the rest of the world.
Our experts agree the fight for racial equality starts within each company and organization. And with talent everywhere, opportunities should be too. Jessica Moore, CBS 2 News.
The sports world has historically brought racial injustice in the U.S. to the forefront with powerful protests and visible changes.
But despite the career-ending challenges some athletes could face, they are still joining the fight. CBS 2's Otis Livingston has this.
Professional athletes have come a long way since 2016 when Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem to silently protest against police brutality. Kaepernick wasn't alone, but his brave stance certainly wasn't accepted by many, which probably prevented other athletes from taking a stand in fear of losing their job, which he ultimately did. There's been a drastic change in that mentality over the past year.
We, the National Football League, condemn racism and the systematic oppression of Black people.
2 days later, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell admitted that the league should have listened to the players' concerns earlier. Athletes all over the globe showed their support for the Black Lives Matter movement.
People are like, oh, you'll be silenced. When we used to people trying to tell us to shut up, we don't care. We here. We gonna say what we gotta say. We gonna say how we feel.
We keep loving this country, and this country does not love us back.
It became overwhelming for some, including the Mets' Dominic Smith, following the August police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
I just don't want to see it happen to my kids, and that's the thing that I fear.
However, the 25-year-old Smith does believe we're making strides.
2019, those conversations weren't happening, and athletes weren't standing up. And obviously you had, the Colin Kaepernicks of the world, the LeBron James, but it's still a ton of athletes who aren't the elite, who have a voice, who feel a certain type of way.
Sports columnist William C. Roten says there are still big obstacles moving forward.
Basically fear. If you're anyone other than LeBron James speaking up, speaking out, and not just speaking out, but doing stuff, demonstrating. I think the greatest obstacle is, will you be punished by people on the team who think that you should just shut up and dribble? A lot of people have gotten over the fear and said, well, you know what, I'm making a lot of money. And the money allows me, gives me sort of a freedom to talk and do stuff. That's the thing that we've all grappled with in this country over generations is sacrifice. Yeah. What are you willing to sacrifice? How much and when?
As outrage over George Floyd's murder spread around the world, it prompted many to look at their own biases and engage in tough conversations on racial equality.
But now that protests have waned, are people still putting in the work? Here is CBS 2's Jessica Layton.
Yeah. Helping hands, kind hearts, and open minds. It's what you'll find outside the Astoria houses in Queens. Hi there. 7 months pregnant and in the hot sun, Lisa Helmy Johansson wouldn't miss a chance to serve lunch and share her smile. She made it her mission to make a difference, providing food and clothing in communities of color after the death of George Floyd.
It really ripped me from a place of complacency that I admit and own up to.
Following that death, her organization to promote social equality called Court Square Justice was born. It's one of many groups you'll find outside this NYCHA complex, trying to connect with neighbors they may not have known before. Before this, how much connection did you have to people within the brown and black communities?
I had never come to Astoria houses before. I've lived in Astoria for like a decade. I realized that I had to do something.
Solidarity can also be felt in the sanctuary of the First Presbyterian Church of Forest Hills. As COVID collided with another tragedy, Pastor Jeffrey Corder says it provided more space for members to self-reflect and, yes, even change their perspective.
It led to some thoughtful and opening discussions as far as people not realizing their own biases sometimes. You're never going to change anything by staying in our little pods of safety.
Through a townwide book club in Millburn, New Jersey, bookhouse owner Nadej Nicole learned inaction can also be racism. The group of 80 or so read several books that explored the history of racism, white privilege, unconscious bias, and how to not only be an ally, but an active supporter.
Taking it one step at a time to go into a more uncomfortable zone where we were willing to look at ourselves and the way we act and how we could make ourselves better.
And I think the lesson, no matter how you've grown this year, is that we can always learn more about others, right?
We have such a long way to go. We can definitely learn by listening to others. People are going through an unbelievable amount of discriminations in everyday life that I had no idea. So I think that to me was very uncomfortable, but really taught me to open my eyes more.
Signs of support for Black lives have never been more apparent. Our communities have never been so awakened. It's only the beginning, but it's a better start for the baby Lisa will soon bring into the world. Jessica Layton, CBS 2 News.
The murder of George Floyd didn't just galvanize a global movement against police brutality and excessive force. It shined a glaring spotlight on racial injustice and systemic racism in the United States. The demand for accountability and transparency, the demand not to be an other, but just to be another human being are simple.
Creating a new reality requires a willingness to continue the conversation, to cultivate a culture of inclusivity, of communicating so that everyone is heard and real change begins to take shape.